Far Cry 6 has recently made a comeback, and with that we learned a lot of new information about the game. But while it is exciting to see what's in store for us when it comes to single player, I want to touch upon the subject of multiplayer. As of this moment, we do not know if Far Cry 6 is even going to include a PvP component, as arcade mode is not coming back and the developers are seemingly putting all of their chips on the campaign alone. So treat most of this video as a what-if scenario. One thing we do know, however, is that Far Cry was never focused on the PvP aspect, and most of the time multiplayer was nothing but a short-lived addition to the game. However, assuming that Far Cry 6 may still invest in including a multiplayer mode, I think it has a big opportunity to elevate it above being made only to increase the value of the game. We're going to dive into how it could achieve that in just a minute, but first I think we need to take a look at the previous PvP modes and see why they failed to capture players' interest long term. I believe that the main issue with the way Ubisoft has crafted multiplayer in the previous games is that they simply failed to align it with what single player was offering. Obviously, most people buy Far Cry for the campaign and its features: expansive sandbox, huge open world, big array of weapons and customization, vehicles, looting, crafting, hunting wildlife, and so on and so forth. For example, a player might have a great time enjoying Far Cry 3, running around the vast jungles of Rock Islands whilst being chased by an angry tiger, scavenging materials and supplies, blowing up outposts, skydiving with a wingsuit, etc. But when the same person enters the multiplayer section of the same game, they are greeted with an arena-style game mode which in its mechanics has very little in common with what campaign was offering. Far Cry 4 took things in a different direction and finally incorporated some of its systems into the multiplayer, with addition of animals, vehicles, and many tools at players' disposal. However, the multiplayer in this game clearly aimed to deliver a more competitive experience, which paired with the heavily asymmetrical design may have turned off a lot of people away from it. And Far Cry 5, well, it's probably the laziest and most disappointing incarnation of multiplayer in any Far Cry game to date, with it offering nothing but deathmatch and team deathmatch as part of the arcade. Now, don't get me wrong, there is certainly some fun to be had with these modes, but as all of these had barely anything in common in terms of their design when compared to the main offering of their respective games, it's easy to see why most of these died pretty quickly, and in a matter of mere weeks from launch they were already rather scarcely populated. Now, back to Far Cry 6. How could it fix this issue? I think it should simply try to incorporate some of the key selling points of a Far Cry game in its multiplayer section. Bigger maps, more sandbox-like design, perhaps team-oriented game modes, increased player count to let's say 16 to 32 players, maybe even add a touch of PvPvE by incorporating wildlife into it. Possibilities are vast, and with the new additions such as the Resolver system, improved vehicle customization, the inclusion of tanks and military-grade aircraft, I think Far Cry 6 has great potential to turn its multiplayer mode into something that players will have a reason to be excited about and stick with for an extended period of time. There are certainly many ways in which it could be accomplished, and here is my own concept of how it could be like, though keep in mind that I'm not saying that this is the only way in which it could be done. So, imagine this. There are two teams, Yaran Army and the Libertad, which is the Rebellion. The mode would ideally involve up to 32 players, 16 per team, and it would be set on slightly bigger maps with more open design. The goal would be for the rebels to destroy the enemy points of interest, may it be anti-air batteries, supply stations, army checkpoints, radio transmitters, you name it. Obviously, the goal of the Yaran Army would be to protect these points. There could be a ticket system or simply a time limit that would ensure that the army would eventually win if rebels fail to complete their goals. Now the twist could be that each team would spawn with access to similar low-grade weapons and vehicles, which would encourage them to venture out into the world in order to gather resources. Rebels would have to scavenge the map for crafting materials, which would allow them to create makeshift weapons and vehicle upgrades at their home base. Yaran Army, on the other hand, would not be able to craft, but instead they would have to hunt down the rebels in order to loot their bodies for money, which in return could be spent at their home base in order to purchase better military-grade weapons as well as contribute money into the team budget, allowing to eventually purchase access to heavier vehicles, such as tanks and helicopters. To make things more interesting, wildlife could randomly spawn and roam around the map, posing an unexpected threat to both teams. Perhaps to counter the firepower of the army, rebels could be given an option to tame some of the animals and use them to their advantage. The dynamic weather could also play a role, with randomly generated thunderstorms and fog affecting the gameplay in more or less impactful ways. The Yaran setting of Far Cry 6 would also allow for a better variety of maps, with jungles, mountains, swamps, villages and urban areas. All in all, it is a rather rough idea that certainly could be improved and expanded upon even further, but I think this kind of design would feel a lot more Far Cry, and thus would fit much better with what we come to expect from single-player part of these games. Time will certainly tell what Ubisoft will do with the multiplayer mode in the upcoming game, or indeed if it will even be a part of the package in the first place. It is quite likely that PvP will be entirely absent from the game, and perhaps it might be for the best, though it is a shame that we are not going to get a successor to Far Cry Arcade, as it also had a huge opportunity to grow. Either way, let me know what you think about it. I hope you'll have a good day and take care.